He was the last man they left inside the fort. Everyone else had gone. The garrison, the engineers, the officers with their folded maps and their marching orders. All of them packed up and filed out through the sally port one grey morning, and not one of them ever came back, but the old soldier stayed. For reasons he never fully explained to anyone, he kept living inside those angled stone walls long after the army had crossed the fort off its ledgers and forgotten the place existed. And years later, when a traveller finally sat down across from him and asked the question everyone asks, why on earth build a fort in the shape of a star, the old man didn't answer right away. He looked at the walls for a long moment. Then he leaned forward and said something that people have been arguing about ever since. He told the traveller the walls were never built to keep armies out. They were built to hold something in. Now, before you decide he was just a lonely man talking nonsense to pass the time, you should know that there are thousands of these forts. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. They are scattered across nearly every continent, on coastlines and riverbanks and hilltops, from Europe to the Americas, from Africa to Asia to islands most of us have never heard of. And they all share the same strange, deliberate shape. Points radiating outward like a compass, rows carved into the earth. Historians have a tidy explanation for all of it, but the old soldier had a different one. And once you actually look at these structures, really look at them, that tidy explanation starts to feel a little too neat, a little too rehearsed. So today we are going to sit with his story. We are going to walk the walls, count the points, and ask the question he wanted us to ask. What were the star forts really built to hold? Let's start with what the history books tell us, because you should always understand the official story before you question it. The mainstream explanation is that star forts, sometimes called bastion forts, were a response to gunpowder. The reasoning goes like this. For centuries, castles were tall and round. High vertical walls kept out men with ladders and battering rams, but then cannons arrived, and everything changed. A tall stone wall is a wonderful target for a cannonball. It cracks, it crumbles, it falls. So, military engineers, the story says, redesigned the fortress from the ground up. They made the walls low and thick, so cannonballs would thud into packed earth instead of shattering brittle stone. And they added those pointed bastions at the corners so that defenders could fire along every wall without leaving a single blind spot. Attackers approaching any face of the fort would find themselves caught in a crossfire from two directions at once. It is, on paper, an elegant piece of engineering. Geometry turned into a weapon. And for a long time, that explanation satisfied almost everyone. It is taught in schools. It fills the plaques at tourist sites. It sounds reasonable, and reasonable things are easy to accept. But the old soldier had spent his whole life inside one of these places, and he said the plaque on the wall was written by people who had never lived there. He said the men who wrote the official history were describing what the forts were used for, not what they were built for. And there is a difference. A cathedral can be used as a barn if you fill it with hay. That does not make it a barn. So he asked the traveller to consider a few things that the tidy explanation quietly steps around, and once you hear them, they are hard to unhear. The first thing is the sheer number of them. If star forts were simply the best military design of their era, you would expect to find them clustered where the fighting was, built during the decades when that fighting happened, and then abandoned or torn down when warfare moved on. Instead, we find them almost everywhere, including places that never saw a serious battle. We find them guarding sleepy harbours that no enemy ever threatened. We find them inland, far from any border, watching over quiet farmland. The old soldier used to say that if you build a lock, you are expecting a thief. So who exactly was every one of these remote, peaceful places expecting? And why did they all reach for the identical answer, down to the last angle and proportion, across oceans and languages and cultures that supposedly had no contact with one another? That was the second thing that troubled him, the uniformity. When human beings solve a problem independently in different corners of the world, they tend to solve it differently. Roofs in one country look nothing like roofs in another. Bridges, boats, temples, tools, they all carry the fingerprints of the people who made them. But the star forts look like they came off the same drafting table. The same points, the same layered ditches, the same ravelins sitting out front like smaller stars orbiting the main one. Believers in the alternative story ask a fair question. How does an isolated island fort in one hemisphere end up as a near mirror of a fortress on the far side of the planet, built supposedly by people who had never met and never shared a single blueprint? The official answer is that good ideas travel, that engineers copied one another through published manuals. Maybe so. But the old man had held those stones with his own hands, and he did not believe you could copy a feeling. And he insisted these places had a feeling. If you have never gone looking for these places, it is worth understanding just how many of them there are and how alike they are. There is a town in the Netherlands, Naarden, that is itself a star, a whole community living inside the points. Not far away sits Bourtange, another star, restored so completely that you can walk its ramparts today and stand exactly where a sentry stood centuries ago. In Italy there is Palma Nova, a perfect nine-pointed star with streets radiating out from a central hexagon like spokes from the hub of a wheel. In France there is Neuf Brisach, laid out with a precision that would satisfy a watchmaker. Across the ocean, in the Americas, forts like the one in Baltimore that inspired a national anthem carry the same pointed silhouette. And then there are the hundreds of smaller, poorer, half-forgotten stars decaying in fields and on hillsides, in places whose names never made it into any book. The old soldier had only ever lived in one of them, but he had heard, over the years, from men who had served in others, and they all told the same story, the same angles, the same silence at the centre, the same feeling that they were caretakers of something older and stranger than the flag flying over the gate. He described it to the traveller slowly, because he knew how it would sound. He said that on certain nights, when the wind came off the water and moved through the fort at just the right angle, the whole structure seemed to hum, not loudly, not something you could point a stranger toward and say, "There, do you hear it?" It was lower than that, a vibration you felt in your chest and the soles of your feet more than in your ears. The younger soldiers, back when there were younger soldiers, used to say the fort was breathing. The officers told them to stop being superstitious. But the old man had felt it for 50 years, and he had come to believe that the shape of the walls was not an accident of warfare at all. He believed the points and the angles and the precise geometry were doing something to the air and the water and the earth itself, gathering it, focusing it, the way a lens gathers light. Now this is where the story leaves the comfortable ground of history and steps into something stranger, and this is exactly the moment when most people either lean in or walk away. The alternative theory, the one the old soldier was circling around, goes something like this. There is a school of thought, controversial and dismissed by mainstream scholars, that argues these structures were never primarily military, that the star shape, the water-filled moats, the specific stones chosen, the copper and iron worked into the design, were components of a system meant to collect a kind of natural energy from the environment, atmospheric energy, some call it, earth energy, say others. The idea is that the ancients, or a lost civilization erased from the record, understood how to draw usable power out of the ground and the sky, freely, without burning anything, and that these forts were the machines that did it. The soldiers and cannons came later, the theory says. Newcomers who found these structures already standing didn't understand what they were, and simply moved in and put them to the only use they could imagine, war. It sounds like fantasy. I want to be honest with you about that, because you deserve honesty and not a salesman. There is no accepted scientific evidence that walls of stone and water generate free energy. Engineers will tell you, correctly, that a moat is a moat, and a bastion is a firing platform, and that we have detailed written records of the men who designed these forts, their names, their treatises, their salaries. The paper trail for the conventional story is real, and it is long. To believe the old soldier, you have to believe that this entire paper trail is either a later invention or a description of people who inherited something they did not create. That is a heavy thing to believe. And yet the questions do not go away just because the answers are uncomfortable. Because here is what keeps pulling people back to this story. The moats. The official explanation says a water-filled ditch slows down attackers and stops them from tunneling under the walls. Fair enough. But many star forts have water arranged in ways that make very little military sense. Moats that don't fully surround the fort. Channels that seem designed to move water through the structure rather than simply sit in front of it. Believers point at these and ask why a purely defensive ditch would need to flow. Water that flows, they argue, is water that is doing work. And water doing work inside a giant geometric structure made of specific minerals starts to sound less like a bathtub and more like a component. Then there are the materials. The old soldier spent years running his hands along the inner walls, and he swore the builders had been particular in a way that pure defense could never explain. Certain forts contain veins of quartz in their stone. Some incorporate metals that a frugal military engineer, watching every coin, would never waste on a wall that only needs to stop a cannonball. Quartz, as it happens, is a mineral that does peculiar things under pressure and vibration. It is used in modern electronics precisely because it responds to and generates electrical charge. The believers seize on this. They ask why builders on a tight military budget would haul in quartz-rich stone if all they wanted was a hard wall. Skeptics answer, reasonably, that builders used whatever stone was local and cheap, and around it goes. Every anomaly has an ordinary explanation if you want one, and a stranger explanation if you are willing to sit with it. The old man had sat with it for half a century. There is one more detail the old soldier kept returning to, and it is the one that is hardest to laugh off, because you can test it yourself in any structure with the right proportions. Sound. He said that certain spots inside the fort did strange things to a human voice. Stand in one place and speak normally, and your words travelled clear across the parade ground to a spot far away, as if the walls were carrying them by hand. Stand a few steps to the side, and the same words died in the air in front of your face. He said the builders had known exactly where those points would fall, because the shape that creates them is not random. It comes from the geometry. And here the alternative theory sharpens into something almost testable. Believers argue that a structure precise enough to focus sound is a structure precise enough to focus other things too. Vibration, pressure, the subtle movements of the earth beneath it. To them, the acoustic tricks are not a party game. They are a symptom, evidence that these walls were tuned, the way an instrument is tuned, to resonate with something in their surroundings. And then there is the mathematics of the shape itself, which sits at the heart of the whole argument. A star fort is not just a pretty pattern. Its angles obey rules. The points are set at intervals that recur across forts built supposedly by unconnected peoples, and the same proportions turn up again and again, the kind of proportions that appear in the growth of shells, and the spiral of galaxies, and the branching of trees. The people who reject the alternative story say this is simply good geometry doing what good geometry does, because there are only so many efficient ways to arrange a defensive perimeter. The people who embrace it say you do not stumble onto the mathematics of nature by accident while trying to stop a cannonball. You arrive there on purpose, because you understand that those proportions do something. The old soldier could not have told you the numbers. He had no schooling in any of it. But he said that when he walked the walls at the correct pace, counting his steps between the points, the rhythm of it felt less like patrolling a barracks and more like pacing out a prayer. But the part of his account that unsettled the traveller most was not the walls or the water or the stone. It was what he claimed the forts were built to hold, because he did not think they were built to hold an enemy. He did not even think they were built to hold soldiers. He thought they were built to hold a charge. He described the centre of the fort, the open parade ground where troops once drilled, as a kind of vessel. He said the walls funneled something inward toward that centre, concentrated it, and that in the fort's original life, before the armies came, that centre was never meant to be a place where men stood shoulder to shoulder. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. It was meant to be kept clear, empty, charged. And he said that whatever the original builders had been storing there, The newcomers eventually let it drain away, because they filled the sacred empty center with barracks and storehouses and horses, never knowing they were smothering the very thing the structure was designed around. Let that sit for a second, because it reframes everything. If he was right, then every photograph you have ever seen of a star fort, crammed with military buildings, is a photograph of a machine after someone parked their furniture in the engine. The tidy explanation would not be a lie exactly. It would just be a description of the ruin, mistaken for a description of the design. So, who were the original builders? This is the question that opens the largest door of all, and it is the door that leads to the theory some of you have been waiting for me to name. The name that gets whispered under videos like this one. The idea of a lost empire, sometimes called Tartaria. Now, I need to be careful here, and I need you to stay careful with me, because this word carries a lot of weight and a lot of nonsense along with it. On old maps, real maps you can find in real archives, there is a vast region of northern and central Asia labelled Tartary or Grand Tartary. That much is simply historical fact. Mapmakers of past centuries used that name for lands they knew little about. The controversy is not whether the word appears on old maps. It does. The controversy is what people have built on top of that word, because a modern movement took that old map label and spun it into something enormous. The claim, in its boldest form, is that there was once a single advanced global civilization, technologically far ahead of what we credit our ancestors with, connected across the whole planet, and that it was deliberately erased from history. Its buildings were reassigned to other cultures, or explained away as the work of much smaller, poorer societies. Its technology was suppressed or forgotten. Its very existence was scrubbed from the school books. And the star forts, in this telling, are among the last surviving pieces of that lost world, fingerprints too heavy and too numerous to wipe away completely. The old soldier had never heard the word Tartaria. He was long dead before the modern movement gave his intuition a name, but when the traveller later encountered the theory, he said it felt like hearing a stranger describe a dream he had already had. After the old soldier died, the traveller could not let the story go. He did what curious people do. He went looking. He pulled old maps out of archives and found, sure enough, the great blank expanses labelled Tartary, sprawling across regions that later maps would carve into other names. He read the old accounts of travellers who had described that part of the world and found them frustratingly vague, full of second-hand rumour and empty spaces. He noticed, as many have, that a name which once covered a huge portion of a continent seemed to quietly disappear from the maps over the span of a few generations, replaced piece by piece until it was gone. To the movement, that disappearance is a smoking gun, proof of an erasure. To historians, it is something far more ordinary. Names on maps change constantly as knowledge improves and borders shift. A vague label for an unknown region gets replaced by specific ones as that region becomes known. There is nothing sinister, they say, about a placeholder being retired once you no longer need a placeholder. The traveller sat between those two readings for a long time, and he admitted he never fully climbed down on either side. What he could not get past was not the maps, it was the forts, because the maps were paper, and paper can be argued about forever. The forts were stone, they were still standing. He could walk up and put his hand on them, exactly as the old soldier had, and feel the same thing the old soldier felt. And no archive, no matter how carefully he read it, ever quite explained that feeling away. Professional historians reject it, and they are not all cowards or conspirators. The mainstream can point to construction records, to the men who designed specific forts, to the gradual and documented evolution of military architecture across the centuries. The story of the Bastion Fort, in the conventional account, is not a mystery at all. It is one of the best documented developments in the whole history of engineering. To accept the lost empire, you have to explain away mountains of ordinary paperwork. And extraordinary claims, as the saying goes, ask for extraordinary proof. So far, that proof has not arrived in a form that convinces the people whose job is to be convinced. But here is why the story refuses to die, and why I think it is worth your time, even if you end up rejecting every word of it. The star forts are genuinely strange. That part is not invented. Stand inside one and you feel the intelligence in the geometry. These were not thrown up by desperate men in a hurry. They were calculated. Every angle answers to every other angle. And there is something in the human mind that cannot look at that much deliberate precision and accept a boring reason for it. We are pattern-seeking creatures. When we see order, we hunt for purpose. The official story gives us a purpose, defense, but for some people it has always felt like the answer you give a child who asks a question you would rather not fully engage. The old soldier felt that way until the day he died. He told the traveller that he had read the plaques, he had heard the officers recite the textbook, and none of it accounted for the hum. None of it accounted for the nights the fort seemed to breathe. None of it explained why he, a practical man who had never chased ghosts, could not shake the certainty that he was living inside something that had once been alive in a way stone should not be. He said the army had given him a fort, but the fort, he was sure, had once been given to someone else, for a reason nobody remembered anymore. Let's follow his logic to its end, because it deserves a fair hearing before we judge it. Imagine, just for the length of this video, that he was right. Imagine a world in the deep past that had learned to draw power out of the environment, not with smoke and fire and turbines, but with shape and stone and water and mineral, arranged so precisely that the structure itself did the work. In that world, you would not need power lines, you would not need fuel. You would build your power source into the very walls of your cities, and it would sit there generating quietly for centuries, asking nothing, burning nothing. And the shape that did this best, the shape that focused the energy of earth and sky toward a central point, might just look like a star pressed into the ground. Now imagine that world ended, whether through war or disaster, or the slow grinding erasure of time and conquest. The knowledge is lost. The people who understood the machines are gone, and into their abandoned structures come new people, poorer in that particular knowledge, who look at these strange, perfect stars and see only one obvious use: walls, defense, a place to put cannons and men. They move in. They fill the empty charged center with barracks. They build the story that these were always forts, because that is the only story that makes sense to them. And over generations, that story hardens into history, until questioning it makes you sound like a madman, or like a lonely old soldier talking to a traveller about a hum in the walls. You do not have to believe any of that. I am not asking you to. I am asking you to notice how completely it explains the things the tidy version leaves dangling: the global uniformity, the forts in places that never needed defending, the strange flowing water, the costly quartz and metal, the feeling. A good story is not proof. Conmen and dreamers both know how to build a story that closes every gap. But a story that closes every gap is at least worth understanding, if only so you can take it apart and see where it breaks. And it does break, in places, if you press on it honestly. The Lost Empire theory struggles to explain why, if these were ancient energy machines, we have such detailed records of comparatively recent men designing and building specific forts. It struggles to explain why the alleged suppression was so thorough in the archives, yet so careless that it left thousands of the buildings standing in plain sight. It struggles, above all, with the simple absence of a working example. If even one-star fort could be shown to generate measurable power, the debate would be over tomorrow, and the textbooks would be rewritten by lunchtime. That has never happened, and the honest believer has to carry that silence with them. There is one more thread worth pulling before we close, because it is the one that turns casual viewers into obsessives. Many of these forts sit sunk into the earth. Their lowest levels are below the surrounding ground, and in more than a few cases, entire chambers and passages have been dug back out of the soil that had swallowed them. The conventional explanation is simple. Forts were built low and partly buried on purpose, because a target you cannot see is a target you cannot hit, and because packed earth absorbs a cannonball better than exposed stone. Over the centuries, mud and silt and neglect did the rest, burying what was already low. That is a perfectly sound account. But the alternative crowd looks at those buried lower levels and asks a different question. Why does so much of the original structure sit below the ground it was supposedly built to defend from above? They see it as evidence that these buildings are older than we are told, old enough to have been half consumed by the slow rising of the earth around them, and that the war-era owners simply built their barracks on top of a foundation they inherited and never understood. Once again, the same stones, two completely different stories, and once again, No way to prove either one to someone determined to believe the other. So where does that leave us? Somewhere uncomfortable, which is usually where the interesting questions live. I think the conventional explanation is probably right about most of it. Star forts almost certainly were built, by the men history names, to fight the wars history records. The engineering makes sense. The paperwork is real. I want to say that plainly so. You know I am not trying to sell you a fairy tale. But probably right about most of it is not the same as certainly right about all of it. And the small, stubborn remainder, the part that the plaque does not quite cover, is where the old soldier lived his whole life. He was not a scholar. He left no documents. He may have been wrong about every single thing. But he spent 50 years with his hands on those walls, and the people who wrote the official history spent an afternoon with a clipboard. If nothing else, that is worth remembering the next time you read a confident sentence about the deep past. Confidence and truth are not the same thing. They are just often mistaken for each other. The traveller asked the old man one last question before he left. He asked him, if the fort was really a machine, and the machine was really drained and dead, why stay? Why spend your final years guarding an empty engine that no longer runs? The old soldier thought about it for a while. And then he said something the traveller wrote down and never forgot. He said, "It is not dead. It is sleeping." He said the charge does not vanish. It only sinks deep, waiting for the centre to be cleared and the water to flow and the shape to do what the shape was made to do. He said one day someone would tear down the barracks and empty out the middle and let the star breathe again. And when that happened, he wanted to be the one who was still there, still standing at the centre, still listening for the hum. He died before anyone cleared the centre. The barracks are still there, or their ruins are. The water sits where the newcomers left it. And the fort, whatever it was built to hold, holds it still or does not, depending entirely on which story you have decided to believe. That is the thing about these places. They do not argue with you. They just sit there in their perfect impossible geometry, keeping whatever secret they keep, letting each of us pour our own answer into the empty space at the centre. The historian pours in defence. The dreamer pours in a lost and shining empire. The old soldier poured in 50 years of his life, and a certainty he could never prove. Maybe the walls really were only ever meant to stop cannonballs. Maybe every strange thing about them has a dull and reasonable cause, and the hum was only the wind, and the old man was only lonely. That is the likeliest answer, and likely answers are usually the right ones. But stand at the centre of a star fort some evening, when the light goes long and the wind starts to move through the angles the way it has for centuries, and ask yourself the question the old soldier wanted you to ask. Not what were these walls used for, we know that, but what were they built to hold? And notice, in the quiet, how much harder that question is to answer than it should be. Because the old soldier is gone now, and the traveller is gone, and all that remains of their long conversation is a claim that refuses to settle. The walls were never built to keep armies out. They were built to hold something in. Stand there long enough, and you may start to wonder what. And that quiet wondering may well be the only thing these strange, perfect stars were ever built to hold.